Okay, so welcome to today's class. The last time we spoke about what RFT is, I gave you a basic account of RFT, and today we're going to talk about some of the applications of RFT. So primarily, we're going to talk about 4 applications of RFT today. So the first application we're going to talk about is how RFT and an RFT-based paradigm can be used to measure what we call implicit attitudes. We're going to talk about the RFT-based tool called the IRAP, which is used to measure implicit attitudes. We're then going to talk about how RFT can be used to raise people's IQ. Then we're going to talk about its use in terms of improving the abilities of children with autism or developmental disabilities. And then we're going to finish off by talking about applications of RFT and RFT-based research and RFT interventions in older adults with dementia.
Okay, so the first area we're going to talk about is the use of RFT and an RFT-based tool called the IRAP to measure something that we call implicit attitudes, which are also sometimes referred to as implicit cognitions. So in the early 2000s, there was a rise of interest in what we call implicit attitudes or implicit measures. So what do we mean when we're talking about an implicit measure? Well, as opposed to just asking people, fill out this questionnaire, do this survey, complete this Likert scale, what do you think about this, what do you think about that, and getting them to self-report their own thoughts, ideas, feelings, or opinions. What an implicit measure does is it's typically based on a computer program and it presents participants with stimuli. So it presents participants with either words or pictures, and participants have to respond. Now, the way in which they respond is different depending on the test, and is different depending on the experiment, and it's different depending on the research and the different kind of implicit measure that they're using. But basically, the basic version of implicit measures is that participants are given words or pictures on a computer screen and they have to respond. We then look at the data and we look at what's called the response latency. So again, remember, response latency is the time between the presentation of a stimulus and a response. So a stimulus is presented, how long does it take before someone responds or someone behaves or someone acts? Also referred to sometimes as reaction times. Okay, so participants are shown words or pictures on a screen and then their reaction times are recorded and measured. And from their reaction times and from the data, we're able to infer what their implicit attitudes are. So the most well-known of the implicit measures is the implicit association test, or the IAT. So the IAT asks participants to associate or to pair images and words together. So it gives them a time pressure, it says you have to do this pretty quickly, and it gives them 2 conditions or 2 sets of rules under which they have to match the stimuli. So for example, they might have 2 categories, so disabled people and healthy people. And then they might have another 2 categories, positive words and negative words. Okay, so let's take, for example, if they have a picture of a person in a wheelchair and a picture of a person playing sports or running. So one's supposed to represent the disabled person and one's supposed to represent the healthy person. And then they have positive words and negative words. So for example, they have the word good and they have the word bad. So what the IAT does is it tells you, okay, in this section of the test, I want you to associate good words with healthy people, and I want you to associate bad words with disabled people, or negative words with disabled people. So then they present you with the word good, and then they ask you, does this go with healthy people or does this go with disabled people? And you put it with healthy people. And then they show you the word bad, and they say, does this go with healthy people or does this go with disabled people? And you put that with the disabled people. Then they swap the conditions and they say, okay, now I want you to associate positive words with disabled people, and I want you to associate negative words with healthy people. So this time around, they show you the word good, and you associate that or you pair that with disabled people, and then they show you the word bad, and you associate that or pair that with healthy people. So what they're looking at in the IAT and what the majority of implicit measure research is looking at is, again, this response latency or reaction times, and they look at the average difference in milliseconds between the conditions. So do you find it easier to pair or to associate good words with healthy people and bad words with disabled people? Or do you find it easier to associate good words with disabled people and bad words with healthy people? So they aim to look at this kind of difference across the two blocks or across the trials and try to investigate which do you find it easier to respond to. And then this ease of response is thought to reveal an implicit attitude. So research using implicit measures have oftentimes found very unexpected results that diverge from those which are obtained by self-report. So this is the key part of implicit research, is that if we ask people, are you racist? Are you homophobic? Are you sexist? They're going to say no. And if you give them a questionnaire that says, how likely are you to engage in racist behaviors, etc., they're going to respond in a socially appropriate manner, and there's going to be social biases, and they're going to respond in a way that might not actually be reflective or might not actually be true to their actual behaviors and their actual thoughts and their actual attitudes. So, for example, individuals who have expressed very equal-based, equality-based views and egalitarian-based views have often been found to show implicit biases on the IAT in relation to race, religion, age, nationality, gender, and sexuality. So even if people self-report on a questionnaire or self-report when they're asked, what are your thoughts on religion? What are your thoughts on nationality? Are you racist, etc.? Even when they express very equality-based views, when they're assessed at an implicit level, they're often shown to have quite significant biases in relation to these areas. So more importantly, implicit biases were shown to increase the researcher's ability to predict future behaviors above and beyond self-report measures. So this is interesting as well. We're always trying to, as part of behavioral science and as part of psychology, trying to be able to predict the likelihood of behaviors occurring in the future. So if we look at explicit measures, which are self-report measures or Likert scales or questionnaires, etc., and if we compare them to implicit measures and results from implicit measures are much more accurate at predicting how an individual is going to act in the future in comparison to explicit measures. So implicit measures might be less sensitive to variables which relate to social desirability and conscious awareness than standard self-report. So social desirability is this phenomenon of responding in a way that's socially desirable. So responding in a way that you know or that you think the researcher wants you to respond in, or responding in a way that you think is the best way to respond. So you've been taught by society that you shouldn't be sexist, or you've been taught by people in your environment that you shouldn't be racist. So you respond in that way. Does that mean that you're actually not sexist or you're actually not racist? No, it just means that you are responding in a socially desirable way. And that's very easy to do on an explicit measure. That's very easy to do on a questionnaire or a Likert scale, etc., etc. But it's much harder to do on an implicit measure. Implicit measures are much better at identifying these nuances in attitudes. So the IAT has been shown, for example, to predict voting patterns amongst individuals who explicitly report they have not yet made up their mind. So they go, they're polled, they're asked, what are you, Democrat? This was based in America. Are you Democrat? Are you Republican? What's your leaning? Do you have any decisions made yet in terms of who you're going to vote for? And they self-report and they say, no, I haven't made up my mind. I haven't decided. I'm completely 50-50. And then they do an IAT to look at their implicit attitudes to see whether they're implicitly more Republican or Democrat. And then the results from their IATs are much stronger predictors and are able to predict how they're going to end up voting in the future. So prediction also of future self-harm and suicide attempts over and above existing self-report measures or personal clinical estimations of risk. So this is another interesting one, and this area is actually quite important and quite relevant. When we're carrying out, assessments of mental health problems, oftentimes they're based on explicit measures and explicit reports. The DAS, for example, the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale, is a self-report measure. So you ask people, how depressed have you felt in the last month? How anxious have you felt in the last month, etc., etc. So individuals who have depression, have anxiety, have suicidal ideation are likely to harm themselves. But if we're to look at explicit measures, if we're to look at a self-report, we might look at a self-report of someone and it might show that they're very low on depression or that they're very low on anxiety because they're responding in a way that they think you want them to respond, or they're responding in a socially desirable way. So the explicit measures, the self-report measures, might not be very good at adequately capturing, for example, how depressed or how anxious or how suicidal an individual actually is. Whereas implicit measures have been shown to predict future self-harm and suicide attempts much more so than self-report measures. So for example, existing self-report measures might ask an individual, do you feel suicidal? Have you had suicidal thoughts in the last 5 days? Have you had thoughts of self-harming in the last 10 days, etc., etc.? And then they might report no, 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 or they might report very low scores. But when they do an implicit association test and they're associating negative words or harm words with themselves, this has been indicated to suggest that they're more likely to engage in self-harm over the coming time. So an alternative to the IAT is the IRAP. So with the IAT, at the end you get a result and it tells you that you were either strongly in favor, for example, of, if we go back to the example that I gave in the last section when we're talking about disabled people versus healthy people, the response from the IAT might be, or your results from the IAT might be, you are strongly automatically in favor of healthy people. That means that you, for the most part, responded much more quickly when you were asked to pair positive words with healthy people in comparison to when you were asked to pair positive words with disabled people. So if you do that really, really quickly, if you're really quick at pairing positive words with healthy people, the end result is going to say to you, the end IAT result is going to say, you are strongly in favor of healthy people. If you're pretty even between responding positive words with healthy people and positive words with disabled people, it's going to tell you you're pretty neutral. And if, for example, you are much more quick at responding when it asks you to associate positive words with disabled people, it's going to tell you that you're strongly in favor of disabled people. Now, this is problematic because we know that attitudes and thoughts are much more varied and much more diverse than simply saying you're strongly in favor of disabled people or you're strongly in favor of healthy people. What if, for example, someone likes healthy people, dislikes healthy people, they like disabled people and they dislike disabled people? What if they have a variety of attitudes and a variety of thoughts? Are attitudes and thoughts as simple or as black and white or as dichotomous as you prefer healthy people and you prefer disabled people? Or you like disabled people 40%, but you prefer healthy people at 60%. That's a very dichotomous black and white simplified version of our attitudes and of our thoughts. And we know that attitudes and thoughts are more complex than this. So the IRAP tries to address this problem, and obviously it does it through a behavior analytic method and through a relational frame theory basis. So to go through the IRAP is the implicit relational assessment procedure. So the IRAP, pronounced the IRAP, implicit relational assessment procedure. An interest in the development of the IRAP came from understanding how do we think at the current time? How are we currently relating stimuli to each other? So the interest in implicit attitudes came out of an interest in understanding the dynamics of arbitrarily applicable relational responding. So again, we covered this in the RFT lecture, AA or. So relating arbitrary stimuli to each other as it actually occurs. So as we're actually currently in this time, in this moment, how are we currently arbitrarily applicably relationally responding? How are we currently relating stimuli to each other? So also known as thought. So what are we currently thinking at this time, at this moment, or what are we currently relating in an arbitrary manner? So the IRAP was developed as a measure that was capable of producing data on the strength of individual relational responses. So how strong are the relational responses that we're making? How strong are we at relating to certain stimuli to each other? So the IRAP quickly emerged as a measure of implicit thoughts or implicit cognitions or of implicit arbitrary applicable relational responding. But as I said previously, it differs a good bit from the IAT. So the primary differences between the IRAP and the IAT are as follows. So as I said, the IAT produces a single metric. It tells you that you're more strongly in favor of healthy people than you are of disabled people. But, for example, the IRAP gives you much more detailed information. So the IRAP assesses individual relational responses. So the IRAP produces 4 results for participants as opposed to just one for each individual relational response that's being targeted by the measure. So, for example, if we go back to the idea of the disabled people versus the healthy people and the good responses versus the bad responses, the IRAP tells you how strong are you at associating or relating from a behavioral point of view, how strong is your relationship between disabled people and positive words. But it also tells you how strong is your relationship between disabled people and negative words. And then it tells you how strong is your relationship between healthy people and positive words, and how strong is your relationship between healthy people and negative words. So whereas the IAT just gives you 1 score, the IRAP gives you 4 scores because there's 4 things happening there. You're looking at healthy people versus disabled people, and you're relating both of those. You're relating healthy people to positive stimuli and negative stimuli, and you're relating disabled people to positive stimuli and negative stimuli. So why would you only get 1 score? There's 4 relationships happening there. There's 4 relational framing sequences happening there. So the IRAP gives you 4 results, 4 metrics, 1 for each of the relational responses that are being targeted by the measure. So the IRAP is unique in that it can assess the relative strength of complex stimuli, so relational networks over and above simple equivalence relations. So again, remember, RFT goes above and beyond just equivalence. It looks at complex relational networks. So how do we relate stimuli in a complex way? So not more than just stimulus equivalence. So the IRAP, as I've said, has been used in hundreds of studies. If you put in implicit relational assessment procedure into Google Scholar, you'll see hundreds of studies. I actually am going to have a document which has a list of good IRAP studies for you to have a look at on a really interesting variety of topics. So it's just the references in the document, but you can just pop them into Google Scholar and you'll be able to find the actual paper itself. Because there's so many papers on the IRAP out there, I've pulled some that I think are of interest and are on interesting topics that you could have a read of if you're interested. But the IRAP has been used to measure attitudes towards Alzheimer's, towards fear of spiders, cyberbullying, mental health issues, vegetarian attitudes, self-esteem, racist attitudes, anti-fat attitudes, city versus country life attitudes, nationalist attitudes, attractiveness bias, etc., etc. So it's been used to measure attitudes towards virtually everything and anything. Research that I've been carrying out recently was interested in using the IRAP to look at attitudes towards victim blaming for victims of sexual assault. I've also carried out research on attitudes towards children with ADHD and anxiety. I've also been involved in research that looks at attractiveness in terms of whether people are deemed to be guilty or not guilty of crimes. So it can be used for a wide variety of attitudinal-based research.
So I just want to go through a little bit more about the IRAP. So as I said, the IRAP is the implicit relational assessment procedure, and it was a tool developed to measure relational frames or relational framing or relational responding in flight or as it's currently happening or at the current time, or also referred to as thoughts sometimes, so current thoughts that people are having. It was developed by Dermot Barnes-Holmes, who was based in Maynooth, and Ian Stewart, who was based in Galway. So again, this being a very Irish-based piece of research. And it was first published in the Irish Psychologist in 2006. And so the IRAP describes itself as giving a behavioural analytic account of human cognition, or from a behavioural point of view, what we call verbal relations in flight, so as they're currently happening at the current moment. So the IRAP was developed in order to assess the strength or probability of relational responding that had been established during the pre-experimental history of the participant. So what does that mean? So again, remember, what are we talking about when we're talking about relational frame theory? We're talking about how do we relate stimuli to each other. So you're being presented with stimuli on the screen. How strong is the relationship that you have between these two stimuli. And the pre-experimental history, so pre-experimental just meaning before you sit down in front of the computer and before you are there in the experiment room or before you're doing the research. So effectively, through your development and as you've grown up and from your history, how strong are the relations between these stimuli? So how strongly reinforced are the relationships between the stimuli that we're investigating? So the strength and the probability of the relational responding that you have between certain stimuli. So as I've said, like the IAT, the IRAP is a computer-based task that requires participants to respond quickly and accurately to sets of stimuli. Okay, so the IRAP puts you under time pressure. You have to respond within 2 seconds of the stimuli coming up, and you have to respond in an accurate manner. Participants must follow a response pattern that might be considered consistent or inconsistent with their previous learning. So the easy thing about the IRAP is that it tells you how to respond. It tells you what to do. It gives you the answers. It says, okay, in this condition, respond in this way, or in this condition, respond in a different way. However, the thing about the IRAP is it is interested in looking at how quickly and how easily do you respond under these two conditions. So some conditions are going to be consistent with your history and consistent with the way you've thought all your life, and some are going to be inconsistent with the way you've thought all your life. So participants are presented with trials or presented with situations or trials on the screen where label stimuli are presented at the top of the computer screen. Target stimuli are presented in the middle of the computer screen. So, for example, you might have, if we're talking again about disabled people versus healthy people, you might have a word or a sentence at the top of the screen, or the label stimuli, and it might say something like, disabled people are, and then in the middle of the screen, or the target stimuli, you're going to have a word that might be a good word or a bad word. So it might be like, disabled people are at the top of the screen, and then in the middle of the screen, it might say good, happy, positive, or it might say bad, negative, awful, terrible, etc., etc. So then at the bottom of the screen, there's a true and a false option. So there's a true and a false response. So the idea being that your relational responding should be quicker and more accurate for your thought pattern that you've had for a long time. So if you have always had an implicit relational frame of, oh, disabled people aren't great, or disabled people, there's something wrong with them, or they're not good people, or they have problems, or they have issues. If that's been a relational frame that you have, or if that's been a thought that you've had for a long time, it's going to be much more easy to respond quickly when you're being asked to relate negative stimuli to disabled people. If you've spent 20 years of your life thinking that disabled people are bad, it's going to be much harder for you to respond in a way under time pressure that's associating disabled people with positive stimuli. So, as I said, the stimuli are presented in the forms of trials within a series of blocks. It's a bit complex, so you don't need to know too much about that. But as we said, relational responding should be quicker and more accurate across the blocks of trials that require responding consistent with your history of your thoughts, or your learning history and response biases. Blocks that require responding in a manner that are inconsistent with the participant's learned history or response biases should be slower. So again, remember the IRAP is giving you two situations. It's giving you a situation where you have to respond in a way that might be consistent with your learned history and a way that might be inconsistent with your learned history. So I'm going to give an example of an IRAP now in a few minutes. I'll make it much more easy to understand. So again, the data that we look at from the IRAP is the response latency. So under which condition were you able to respond more quickly? So measured in milliseconds, and it's defined as the time that elapses from the onset of the stimuli in each trial to the emission of the correct response. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of an IRAP, and this is from research that I carried out a couple of years ago, and I was interested in looking at, did teachers have stigmatizing attitudes towards students with either ADHD or anxiety? And I thought this would be of relevance, if they understood about the conditions, etc. And obviously, people might not be aware that they have stigmatizing attitudes. So I was interested in looking at, do they have implicit stigmatizing attitudes towards students with ADHD or anxiety? So as we said, the IRAP gives you rules. It tells you how to respond. And this should make it very, very easy for people to complete the IRAP, right? So the first rule or the first condition says, please respond as if students with ADHD or anxiety have negative traits and normal students have positive traits. The next condition or the next rule says, please respond as if students with ADHD or anxiety have positive traits and normal students have negative traits. Okay, so these are the two rules, these are the two conditions, and you have to respond in the correct way depending on what the rule is. So it tells you at the start, it says, in this section, respond as if ADHD or anxiety students have negative traits and normal students have positive traits. And you do that for a couple of turns. And then it says, okay, now please respond as if students with ADHD or anxiety have good traits or positive traits and normal students have negative traits. So these are some examples of what the screen looks like. So what's presented to participants is just the top part, the middle part, and the bottom part. So those black arrows where it says rule A and rule B, they're not shown to the participants. That's just to demonstrate the responding for you guys. So what's shown to the participants is the top bit where it says a student with ADHD or anxiety is, and then the middle bit where it has the word, and then the true and the false responses at the bottom. So if we say that we're in condition A or in rule A, please respond as if students with ADHD or anxiety have negative traits and normal students have positive traits. And then you're presented with the top left screen there. It says, a student with ADHD or anxiety is weird. If we're in the first rule condition, the correct answer is true. You have to respond in the correct way on the IRAP. So you have to do what the rule tells you. It might not be what you believe. It might not be what you think. You might not have a relational frame that pairs weird with ADHD or anxiety together. But this rule is telling you have to pair these two together. So you have to relate them together. If you don't have a history of pairing these two together, then that's going to be harder for you to do. If you have a history of relating ADHD or relating anxiety as being something weird or something strange or something different, then when you're told respond as if ADHD or anxiety is weird or different, you're going to go, yeah, because you have a history of relating these two stimuli together. If you don't have a history of relating ADHD or anxiety with something being weird, then it's going to be much harder for you to respond in that manner. So how is that going to show itself? It might show itself in you making more mistakes, you automatically pressing the false button because that's how you normally think, or you might take a little bit longer because you have to think through, okay, what do I have to do? I have to respond in a way that I don't agree with here. So if we go over then to the second one where it says a student with ADHD or anxiety is kind, again, depending if we're in rule A or rule B, you can see there if we're in rule A, if you follow the arrow rule A, then the correct answer is false. If we're in rule B, then the correct answer is true. Okay, so a student with ADHD or anxiety is kind. If we're in rule B, it says, please respond as if students with ADHD or anxiety have positive traits. So true will be the correct answer there. Again, this very much depends on what your learned history is. What is your history of relating students or kids with ADHD or anxiety? Do you relate them with positive things? Do you relate them with negative things? And then if we go down to the normal students, do you relate normal students with negative things? Do you relate normal students with positive things? And it's based on how easy is it for you to respond. If you're being told to respond in a way that isn't the way you normally respond or isn't the way you normally relate, then it's going to be much harder, and that is going to show itself in you taking longer to respond or in you making more mistakes. So a second piece of research that I was interested in looking at was whether ADHD or anxiety are gender biased. So do we associate ADHD with boys and do we associate anxiety with girls? So in this piece of research, I asked participants to respond as if boys have ADHD and respond as if girls have anxiety. And then I asked them to respond as if girls have ADHD and boys have anxiety. So again, here's some samples of the screen. So they're shown ADHD, and then they're shown the word Kevin or the name Kevin. If we're in the first rule or the first condition, boys have ADHD and girls have anxiety, then when ADHD and Kevin comes up, the correct answer here is true. When ADHD and Amy comes up, if we're within the first condition, the correct answer here is false. But if we were in the second condition, if we were in please respond as if girls have ADHD and boys have anxiety, when ADHD and Amy comes up, the correct answer there is true. If we go down then to anxiety, if we're in, for example, the second condition, please respond as if girls have ADHD and boys have anxiety. If we see anxiety in Amy and we're following the second rule, then the correct answer there is false, because we're saying that girls have ADHD and boys have anxiety, and anxiety and Amy, those two are not paired together or not related together. So again, it might not be that you believe these things or that they're consistent with your history of learning or consistent with your history of relating these stimuli together, but that's the whole point. If they're inconsistent with your history of relating together, then it's going to take you longer, and so the response latency or the response time is going to be slower if you don't relate the stimuli to each other. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the results of the second study that I carried out. So this was the one that was relating gender, so boys and girls, to ADHD and anxiety. So I'm not going to show you the first study results just because it's a little bit harder to interpret, a little bit harder to understand and to explain. So this one's a little bit easier for you guys to understand. So you can see here there's 4 bars, and this relates to the 4 relations that we were interested in looking at. So we were interested in looking at boys ADHD, boys anxiety, girls ADHD, girls anxiety. So you can see the bars, and you can see up the top it says true, false, false, true. So that relates to the direction or the correct response that people responded more quickly to. So if we look at the left bar, and if we look at the bottom, it says ADHD with boys. So this means that when participants were presented with the word ADHD and a boy's name, they responded very quickly when the correct response was true. So you can see it's a very high bar, and the response there being indicated is true. If we move over to the ADHD and girls, so the second bar, you can see there that it's not quite as strong as a response, but in this instance, participants were responding more quickly when the correct response was false as opposed to when it was true. Now think about that for a second. So participants were more quick to respond when presented with the word ADHD and a girl's name, and the correct answer was false. So this means that participants are not associating ADHD with girls whatsoever. We know that girls make up about 1/3 of ADHD cases. So this suggests that primary school teachers, which is the group that I was looking at, don't associate ADHD with girls in any way, shape, or form. But we know that's not true because girls make up 1/3 of ADHD cases. Then if we go over to the anxiety boys bar, we can see here again, they're responding more quickly when the correct answer is false, again suggesting that primary school teachers weren't associating boys with having anxiety. And we know obviously that boys can have anxiety. And then if we move over to the last column, we can see anxiety in girls and the correct or the response there being true. So participants were more quickly responding when they were given the word anxiety, a girl's name, and when the correct response was true. So what this suggests to us, yes, we'd expect that participants will respond very quickly to ADHD in boys because boys are typically associated with ADHD. But that doesn't mean that girls don't have ADHD. 1/3 of ADHD cases are girls, but from this research results, it indicates to us that implicitly, teachers don't associate girls with having ADHD whatsoever. And if we also go over to the boys one, we can see this is also more quickly responded to when the correct response is false. So given the word anxiety, given a boy's name, and being told to respond false, they respond more quickly in this manner. Again, suggesting that teachers aren't relating boys with anxiety. So they're relating girls with anxiety and they're relating boys with ADHD, and they're saying no, boys don't have anxiety, and nope, girls don't have ADHD, which we know isn't true. So I'm going to leave it there for the IRAP bit. It might be a little bit confusing to understand the results of the IRAP. I know it can sometimes seem a little bit confusing when you're first learning about it. There's lots of papers available on Moodle, and there's lots of resources. If you have any questions, do let me know. If anyone's interested in using the IRAP or looking at implicit attitudes, the IRAP or the IAT, for their final year project, we've had plenty of students do it before. It's quite a nice and interesting experiment. It's something different. You can use the IRAP to investigate attitudes towards almost anything. So any kind of area that you're interested in looking at, you can look at people's implicit attitudes towards it. So if you have any questions about implicit attitude measures or about the IRAP, or want me to talk to you more about the IRAP and interpreting the results, do let me know and I can help you out. So I'm going to leave it there for the minute, and we're going to move on to the second application of RFT. So the second application of RFT that we're going to look at is, can RFT and relational frame theory and training in relational frame theory improve and increase people's IQ? So for a long time, IQ was thought to be a relatively stable trait that didn't change that much. However, recent research has told us that IQ can be malleable. That means it can be changed and it can be influenced by the environment. So it has been a point of a bit of contention and a lot of debate amongst psychologists, but we do know, and there is increasing amounts of evidence, that IQ isn't necessarily a stable inherent genetic trait, that it can be influenced by the environment. So the evidence base is shifting in favor of the idea that intelligence isn't a stable trait, and that there's an increasing role of the environment in terms of determining intelligence levels. So evidence for this perspective comes from educational psychology, cognitive psychology, and neuropsychology. So a lot of the original research would have thought that IQ is genetic, it's inherent, and it can't be changed by the environment. But we do know now that the environment, in terms of who we interact with, how we interact with them, outside forces, education, etc., is going to have an influence on intelligence levels. So a lot of this research has come from educational psychology, cognitive psychology, and neuroscientific psychology, all telling us that the environment does have a role to play in terms of our intelligence levels, and that it's not a natural, inherent, stable trait. So behavior analysis has also recently had an input in this question, in this perspective, through RFT. So as I said, educational psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscientific psychology, and behavior analysis have all said that actually, you know what, IQ can be influenced by the environment. So from cognitive psychology, the primary research has focused on how do we improve working memory, and can working memory have an influence on IQ levels? So primarily cognitive psychology has focused on improving working memory and working memory training, and the impact training your memory has on individuals' intelligence levels. So this is often measured using something that is called Raven's progressive matrices. So Raven's progressive matrices, or RPM, is a kind of IQ test. So it's not a full IQ test, but it's a kind of a version, or a simplified kind of version of an IQ test. It uses pictures and images and asks you to arrange them in certain orders, or asks you to fill in the gap, etc., etc. So it's not a full IQ test, but it's very similar to an IQ test, and it has a strong relationship to IQ tests. So typically, from a cognitive psychology point of view, when they're looking at how can we improve IQ, they typically look at it by trying to improve working memory and then assessing this through Raven's progressive matrices. So for example, Klingberg and colleagues reported that improvements in Raven's progressive matrices scores were seen for both children with ADHD and adults who had been provided with memory training. So suggesting that kids with developmental disorders, we can improve their IQ using memory training, and we can improve adults' IQs using memory training as well. Also, Mackey and colleagues reported again matrix reasoning improvements, or improvements on the Raven's matrix, relating to 10 full-scale IQ points in low socioeconomic children who've been exposed to memory training across a range of modalities. So when they provided memory training to children from a disadvantaged or lower income background, and then they assessed them using the Raven's progressive matrix, this related to an IQ improvement of 10 points. So from a behavioral point of view and from a behavior analysis point of view, behavior analysis has always looked at intelligence from a functional point of view. And behavior analysis and behavioral psychologists don't particularly look at IQ or see intelligence as a trait. Like anything else, we kind of see it as a skill or something that can be learned or a skill set that can be demonstrated or a behavioral repertoire, as we've spoken about previously. So, what we consider IQ measures to be is we consider them to be indicators of fluency of the skills involved. So, we said, we say that mental ability or, cognitive events are skills that are learned like other behaviors. And so, IQ measures are measuring how fluent or how good are you at these skills. And these skills are like any other behaviors that can be learned, they're just happening at an internal private level. So we consider IQ measures to be an indication of how fluent or how good people are at these certain internal private skills. So, for example, Lovas reported that you can train and teach IQ related skills. And he reported IQ gains of up to 30 points, which is 2 standard deviations, following a 3-year ABA intervention for autism. So, after 3 years, these children with autism reported increased IQ gains on an IQ test of about 30 points because their skills had been trained by ABA. So nearly half the autistic children involved in this research were not noticeably intellectually different from normally functioning children after the 3-year program. So after 3 years in this program, Ivar Lovas was able to bring them to a level where they were comparable to children who didn't have autism from an IQ point of view. There was a replication then of this study in 2005, and they recorded similar IQ raises in autistic children, again indicating that improvements in IQ and in IQ scores can relate to training and can relate to learning and can relate to skills that can be taught, and ABA is one way that these skills can be taught. So Smith and colleagues in 1997 also did a similar study using ABA techniques. However, the focus of this study originally wasn't anything to do with IQ. They were using ABA to improve language and to help with challenging behaviors. But after they had completed the ABA treatment, they also did a follow-up IQ measure. So they had 2 groups, one group which received ABA treatment to improve their language and to reduce their challenging behaviors, and they had a control group. They then did an IQ follow-up test, and they found that children in the treatment group or in the ABA group displayed higher average IQ scores than the comparison group. So the ABA group, although it wasn't the original function or the original aim of the ABA intervention, the original aim was simply to improve their language and to reduce their challenging behaviors. As a side effect of the ABA program, there was also an increase in their IQ scores and their IQ levels. So recent research has looked at how do people relate stimuli to each other in terms of their relational responding skills. So remember, we spoke about relational responding, we spoke about combinatorial entailment, we spoke about mutual entailment. So effectively we spoke about, the ability to, if you're told that A is the same as B and B is the same as C, that ability to relate A and C to each other and C and A to each other, etc., etc. So this ability of relational responding, such as stimulus equivalence, but then remember, RFT goes above and beyond stimulus equivalence. So multiple different kind of relations between stimuli. So the ability of people to relate stimuli to each other in a variety of different ways also relates to their ability to be able to perform well on intelligence tests. So for example, O'Hora, this is Dennis O'Hora, who's based in Galway, he found that participants who successfully completed complicated relational framing-based tasks performed much better on the vocabulary and maths or vocabulary and arithmetic sections of the WAIS. So the WAIS is the Wessler Adult Intelligence Scale, and this is probably the most commonly used IQ test by clinical psychologists. So clinical psychologists all over the world use the WAIS to assess intelligence levels, and people who are really good at difficult relational framing tasks are also really good on the IQ scores. So O'Hora, again, in 2008, found that people who are good at temporal relational responding. So again, remember we said that relational responding is viewing stimuli in terms of each other. We can talk about it in terms of a lot of different comparisons. So we can compare stimuli or relate stimuli in terms of same as, bigger than, smaller than, more than, less than, faster than, slower than, etc., etc. So I gave a lot of examples of this in the previous lecture. But people who are really good at temporal relational responding, so before or after, so relating stimuli in terms of which comes first, which comes after, people who are really good at that ability are really good at the block design subtest of the WACE. So you can see there's an image of the block design. So they're given blocks and they're given a pattern that they have to create. And people who are really good at relational responding in terms of before and after also tend to be really good at this block design subtest in this WACE IQ test. O'Toole and Barnes-Holmes also found that people who perform adequately and accurately and very well on IRAP tests or IRAP assignments, which are designed to assess before, after, and similar different relational responding, also do really well on the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test. So participants who score very highly in terms of their fluency of relational responding on the IRAP, specifically when they're looking at before and after and similar different relations, also tend to score really highly on the K-bit, which is the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test. So again, effectively what this is saying is improved relational skills and the ability to be able to relate stimuli to each other can relate to an improvement in IQ levels and IQ scores. So as we said, RFT goes above and beyond simply just talking about equivalence. So it goes above and beyond just saying same as or relating stimuli in terms of stimulus equivalence. So it includes relationships such as more than, less than, before and after, opposite, same, etc., etc. So all of these skills of being able to derive relationships bigger than, smaller than, opposite to, more than, less than, etc., etc., they're all taught and learned through our environment and through social and educational interactions. So what's interesting from an RFT point of view is that a relatively small number of taught and derived stimulus relations can be used to describe a wide variety of intellectual processes. So we can describe a wide variety of cognitive processes or intellectual processes such as vocabulary or problem solving. We can describe them as being frames or as being relational responding. And so from behavioral psychology, from our point of view, we believe that improving a person's skills at relational framing should lead to improvements in a range of mental or cognitive aptitudes or mental abilities and in terms of their general intelligence and educational abilities. So this is a piece of research carried out by Brian Roach from Maynooth and Ian Stewart from Galway and some of their students, Dylan Colbert and Sarah Cassidy. So they were interested in looking at a relational frame skills training intervention to increase general intelligence and scholastic aptitude. So if we can train people in relational framing, is this going to improve their general intelligence and improve their school ability? So I'm going to have this study up on Moodle and also the original study. So this study here is actually a follow-on study to a previous study, and it's a replication study. So I'm going to have both of those studies up on Moodle if you want to have a look at them. But as you can see there in the abstract, the aim of this study was to replicate and extend the findings of the 2011 paper, which found that teaching children to derive relations between stimuli or to relate stimuli to each other increases full-scale IQ in both typically developing children and those with additional needs. So in this current study, so in the current study by Brian Roach and colleagues, it had two experiments in it, which assessed the ability of relational frame training on general intelligence and school-based ability. Both experiments involved using a computer-based training program in schools, and then they assessed them using the WISC, which is the child version of the WACE. So the WACE being the adult intelligence test, and then the WISC being the child intelligence test. And then they did a second experiment, which had a larger sample and used slightly older children, the same intervention, but as opposed to assessing them using an IQ test, they assessed them in terms of their school-based abilities. So the first experiment was carried out in a primary school in Meath, and then the second experiment was carried out with the secondary school students. So effectively, this is what the training looked like. So again, remember, we're talking about relating stimuli to each other. And you'll remember that I taught you, if you were in class the day we spoke about RFT, I taught you a nonsense word, and I related it to the picture, and I related it to the actual written word, and then you created the relations between them. So, for example, if you look at the top left there, this is the kind of training that they go through. So, null is opposite to sim is opposite to jik is the same as year, is sim the same as year? Okay, so try and figure that out for yourself there for a second. So what do you think? So it's this kind of training, this ability to be able to relate stimuli to each other. So this is quite a kind of a complex one. So you can see that there's 3 levels here. So if we look again at the top one, we've got null opposite to sim opposite to jik, and jik the same as year. But they start at basic. So they start with just 1 level, for example. So they start with just null is opposite to sim. And then they'd ask you a question, is sim opposite to null, for example. But they make it more complex, and they develop it on more, and they change the direction. So you can see there, they have null is opposite to sim is opposite to jik, and jik is the same as year. So they've changed it up a bit there. They've got opposites and sames. Initially, they'd just have all the same words. They might have null is opposite to sim is opposite to jik is opposite to year. But they change in and out the kind of relations that they're interested in looking at. And they change the level, so you can have just 1, you can have 2, or you can have 3. So this is kind of a more complex one because there's 3 levels here, and they're swapping in and out the relations that they're interested in looking at. So they train this up, and they get you to practice these skills. They get you to do more than, less than, before, after, bigger than, smaller than, etc., etc. So a wide variety of different kind of relations. So here we have the results of the research. So you can see the bars for each individual participant. There was 15 participants in the first experiment. So the dotted bars on the left of each of the participants is their pre-RFT intervention IQ score, and then the solid bar on the right is their post-intervention IQ score. If you look at the horizontal lines, if you look at the solid black horizontal line there between 90 and 100, you see that that's the class average IQ score. And then if you go up to the dotted line up at 120, that's the average class IQ score after the training. So the class average IQ score before RFT training was at about 95 or so, which is average IQ, and that's kind of what you'd expect. But after only 3 months of training, because that's how long the RFT training took, after 3 months of training, the average class IQ jumped massively to 120. 120 on an IQ test is considered to be massively above average intelligence. That's above 1 standard deviation. And then if you look at some of the individual bars, you can see participant 2 had a massive leap up to an IQ of 140. If you look at participant 6 there, a really considerable leap from about just over 90 or so to coming in just under 120. So really significant gains and changes being made in IQ scores based on this RFT training. So some other research that's looked at RFT and intelligence is research based on a program called PEAK. So you can see this research here carried out by Mark Dixon from the States, from Southern Illinois. He was interested in looking at the relationship between intelligence levels and the PEAK relational training program. Now, the PEAK program is a program that Mark Dixon created, and it's primarily a training and skills program based on RFT, but it's for young people with intellectual disabilities or autism. So it primarily aims to improve their communication, their skills, etc., but it also has a relationship to improving their IQ abilities. So I'm going to finish this part of the lecture here. I'm going to talk about applications 3 and 4, which are using RFT to improve abilities in young people with intellectual disabilities, and using RFT to talk about dementia. I'm going to talk about those 2 sections in the next part of the lecture, so in part 2. So this lecture is going to have 2 videos to it, just because this one, it's getting a bit lengthy already. So we'll talk about PEAK and we'll talk about RFT for dementia in part 2.